Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Emmy's Journey, a novel, by Lila and Beckham, narrated by Christa Lewis. Prologue. In the summer of 1865, Emmaline Gulledge is 11 years old and stubborn as a mule. Determined to do exactly what she sets her mind to, she explores the mountains and valleys around her home with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and a keen eye that misses nothing. When her mother dies, Emmaline, Emmy for short, is thrust into the mystical, spiritual world of her mother's native peoples, the Tsalagi, better known as the Cherokee. Given the power of observation and shape-shifting by her immortal great-great-grandfather Two Feathers, who is the keeper of the sacred fire's ashes, Emmy is told that she must carry on her mother's duties and is charged with the task of becoming the family Ka-no-he ha-ka-no-gezdi, the storyteller. She is supposed to remember and pass down her family's history and tell about their ancestors. As Emmy grows older and matures, her explorations become more advanced. She discovers a hidden path that takes her beyond an ancient willow tree to a layer of the world that, at first, seems much like her own, but she soon discovers that it is quite different. When she stays longer than allowed immortal, she discovers that her grandfather can travel between space and time and communicate with all peoples between the layers of her world. Emmy's journey is a voyage through time and into the mysterious spiritual and mystical realms of the Cherokees and a world that most never know exists. 1. Death eludes her. Etowah County, Alabama, July 1865. Leaning forward, Emmy peered further into the freshly dug grave. She was staring down at the knotted pine box, wondering if her mother's body was still in it. Earlier, she watched her brothers nail the box shut and then carry it out of the house. It now sat on the bottom of the deep hole they had dug beneath the maple tree. When she woke that morning, Emmy had folded her arms across her chest the way she had seen her mother's arms folded, and then she tried to let her body go numb. She tried to make it as still and stiff as her mother's body was when she touched her arm as she lay in the pine box the night before. She wanted to feel what it was like to be dead. Her brothers and sisters had told her that their mother was dead, but Emmy did not believe them. If her mama was dead, then why could she see her wandering around the house? She knew she was not dreaming or seeing things that were not there, but seeing her mother in both the wooden box and walking around the house puzzled her. How could she be in two places at once? Was this a new power? She knew her mother had special powers and assumed she was using those powers to appear dead for some reason. Emmy knew she could hide herself from others if she wanted to. Actually, her mama could do all sorts of magical stuff. However, she insisted that her powers were not magic. She said they were a gift from the Great Spirit, given to her to help others find their way to Him. But while she slept, she could leave her body, walk the night winds, and go anywhere she wanted to. She could soar high in the sky on the back of eagles, and she could talk to the dead. If they were lost, she had the ability to guide them to the passageways that led to the Great Spirit. Her mother told wonderful stories of when she was a young girl, and she told them about their journey from the Carolinas to Alabama when the older children were still very young. She told Emmy and her siblings about their ancestors, what they were like when they were still living, and such as that. She had even told them about their great-grandfather Two Feathers, who had given her powers and helped her find her way. She said he was blind, and his eyes were as white as snow, but he could see better than people with sight could. He was the keeper of the sacred fire and its ashes. Emmy had never seen Two Feathers before, although her older brother Charles had. She also had not spoken with her mother yet, even though she had tried to several times. Her mother never responded. It was as if she were looking right through her. Jeremiah was supposed to be dead, too. Jeremiah was not blood kin, but he was the only grandfather Emmy had ever known. He had lived with her family since before she was born, and most of the time it seemed he was the only person who truly understood her. She could talk to him about anything, and she did, all the time, as a matter of fact. He had never once told her that he was dead. Their insistence that he was dead puzzled her as much as them telling her her mother was dead. If he was a ghost, he could not talk to the living or play games with them as he did her, could he? When she first went outside to the gravesite, Emmy was surprised to see the old white-eyed Indian man. He sat near her mother's gravesite, chanting and tending a fire. Emmy knew it had to be him from her mother's description of him. He was sitting near a thicket of willows. So far he had not uttered a word to Emmy. However, she felt he had come there specifically for her. Earlier, she had heard him and her mother talking, but she could not understand what they were saying. They spoke in a strange language that Emmy believed was her mother's native language. She did not understand Cherokee. Her mother had only taught her a few words, mainly the names of relatives, animals, trees, and place names. Emmy glanced over to the thicket of willows again and then back into the grave. She knew her mother could not stay hidden, nor could she stay quiet forever. She expected her mother to pop up at any moment as if nothing had changed. "Emmy Lou," her brother Charles called, interrupting her contemplations. "Get your tail over here right now," he exclaimed when he saw her leaning forward over the open grave. He was afraid she would slip and fall into the opening. They had enough on their plates to worry about without having her break an arm or a leg and make things worse. Their lives had never been easy, but they had grown up with loving parents who struggled to give them a decent rearing. The death of their beloved mother, so soon after losing their brother Aaron, Jeremiah, who was like a grandfather to them, and their father Henry, who died during the siege of Vicksburg, was hard enough for them to bear. Their mother, Charity, although tiny, was always fierce about protecting her children and about teaching them the ways of her people. She taught all of them the necessities of survival. She taught her sons to hunt and to provide shelter for their families, and she taught her daughters to care for their families' needs. "Why?" Emmy demanded stubbornly as she turned to face Charles. He could tell she was annoyed that he had interrupted her mission. "I was waiting to see Mama walk the winds," she yelled back as he walked toward her. Charles looked down at Emmy. Her long, unkempt hair was flowing in the slight breeze, and the scrunched-up, determined look on her face instantly reminded him of their mother. Out of all of his sisters, Emmy was the one that most resembled their mother. Actually, she was the spitting image of their mama. He could not help but smile. Their mother was gifted of wind, sight, and speech. She was a beloved woman, a passageway to the spiritual realms of the gods. She walked and talked with the dead, walked the winds of the night, and was able to cross boundaries unobserved by human eyes. Charles knew this to be true. He had watched and admired his mother his entire life. She was also a kanoheha, kanogesti, a storyteller, charged with telling the stories of her ancestors, keeping their spirits alive through her words. She was also a didanawiski, a medicine woman. The Great Spirit had given Charity the knowledge of plants and healing. Charles himself had inherited some of those abilities. He was next to the oldest of Charity's children. Emmy was the next to youngest. She had no conception of what their lives were like before they arrived in Alabama in the spring of 1850. "You won't be able to see her walk the wind, silly. She has already crossed into the land of our ancestors," Charles explained to her. "No, she ain't either," Emmy exclaimed, stomping her foot. "I can still see her, you know. She has been talking to that old Indian man y'all said was our grandfather, there, over yonder by the fire." Emmy pointed toward the willows. Charles could not help but look where Emmy was pointing. He wondered why Emmy could see them, and he could not. "Where are they exactly?" Charles asked curiously. "They are over yonder by that crooked old cedar tree," Emmy said, pointing to them where she saw them. "Can't you see them? They're just sitting there talking. I see them plain as day." Charles decided that Emmy's age had to be the reason she could see their spirits, and he could not. He remembered seeing spirits more often as a child than when he was older. When he complained about not seeing them as much as he used to, his mother told him that his mind was more open to the spirits when he was a little boy. She said he needed to free his mind, to open himself to the spirits as he had back then. It was something he was still struggling to do. Freeing his mind was not as easy now that he was a grown man. He had more cause to worry and more responsibilities. His mother's great-grandfather, Two Feathers, was a Cherokee shaman who had lived in the time before the white man spread into Tsalagi, the land given to the Cherokee by the Great Spirit Unquenchable. Unquenchable was the father of creation, the one the white people referred to as God. Maybe it was just the physical essence of his mother and Two Feathers that remained. He was not sure. He could not see anything or anyone where Emmy was pointing. Two Feathers held much wisdom in his soul. He could travel between space and time. He could communicate with those of both worlds. Charles believed that was where his visions came from. He believed they came from Two Feathers. Charles knew that his mother was going to die, and he knew that she would die after receiving and reading a letter written by his father. He had seen her death many times in his visions, the same visions that forewarned him of his brother's death a few months before the war between the states first began. Then they warned him of his father's death during the siege of Vicksburg. They were a curse, though. What was the use in having visions when he was helpless to change the outcome? When the vision of Aaron's death came to him the fall of 1861, it was the first he had ever received of anyone that close to him. He and his brother John were miles away from Culpeper, Virginia, where Aaron's regiment was. He and John were at Port Royal, South Carolina, fighting to keep the Union from gaining control of Fort Walker. Then, on the 26th day of May, 1863, when the vision of his father's death reached out to him, they were marching with General Lee's army to a place called Gettysburg, in Pennsylvania, readying for a great battle that was to take place within the week. And immediately after the vision of his father's death, he walked the night winds. They brought him to the cave where his father lay dying. However, he was not able to touch his father or to get nearer to him. It was as if a barrier was between them, a membrane of some sort. The barrier turned out to be his mother, Charity. She had walked the winds and arrived before him. When his vision cleared, he saw her. She was on her knees, rocking and crying, holding his father's limp body in her arms. She, too, must have seen what was about to happen, the same as she had when his brother Aaron was dying. She had gone to Aaron, too, talked with him, walked with him, and then held him as he lay dying. Charles reckoned he would never know for sure how his mother knew, or why she could touch his father and he could not, why she could cross the distance between space and time and participate in that time as a solid mass, and he not. It was hard on one's heart and mind, knowing that someone you love is going to die and not be able to do anything about it. But the worst was when he had the vision of his mother's death. He loved his mother very much, and it had been a great burden carrying with him the knowledge that she would choose death over a life without their father. That was when he began to lose faith in his abilities. What good were they, if they only allowed him to be an onlooker and not a participator? In the cave where his father lay dying was where he had the vision of the letter his father had written to his mother and then entrusted to a fellow soldier to give to her if he died during the siege. Charles had never told his mother of the letter. He did not want to get her hope up of a final word from his father in case the other soldier died or lost it. The letter came 2 years after his father's death. His mother had mourned more deeply than he expected. She cut her long, flowing locks of thick black hair, then lay down on the bed she had shared with her husband since she was 15 years old, and died right there, a day later. The remembrance of her death, fresh on his heart, brought tears to his pale eyes. Emmy looked up at her brother questioningly. "Charles, how come you don't see them?" she asked curiously, and then before he could even answer her, she asked, "You don't see Jeremiah or the others anymore either, do you?" "No, Emmy, I don't see any of 'em, and I don't understand why," he answered honestly. He had been wondering why his gifts seemed to have vanished. Even before his mother died, he had not been able to see the spirits as well as he had when younger. He wondered sometimes if his mind was just too full to take in any more. His father and Aaron's death, not to mention those he fought alongside during the war, and the endless months and miles they trudged, always having to be watchful lest they walk into an ambush, kept him on edge. "You sort of look like the old Indian man, you know. Your dark eyes are turning a lighter color like his are. You are going to do just as Mama said you would," Emmy exclaimed suddenly, then turned away. "What do you mean? What did she say?" Charles asked, surprised by her words. But Emmy was already a-skipping off toward the old crooked cedar tree, where she had told him she saw their mother and Two Feathers with his fire. Charles faltered. He did not know whether to follow Emmy or attend to the filling in and covering up of his mother's grave. They needed to do that before one of the children fell into it and got hurt. He looked around for his brothers. They would be the ones who helped him. Martha's husband, Ollie Henley, died during the war, and although Nancy's beau, Jefferson Aldridge, was there, he would not be of any help. He was too highfalutin to do manual labor. Charles wondered how Jefferson was going to manage his plantation now that most of his slaves had gone. Charles saw his brothers Uriah and John, but they were still in conversation with neighbors and friends who had come to pay their final respects to their mother. He decided to sit down for a moment of contemplation. He wanted to try to have a conversation with his mother, especially while no one else was around to disturb him. She had been dead for 2 days and had not come to him. He was beginning to feel her loss, and his heart ached for her. He and his mother had been close his entire life. Now she was gone. He crossed his legs Indian style as she had taught him, then sat down as they had when they talked to the spirits of those who had gotten lost on their journey to the passageway. Over by the willows, Emmy was happily skipping around the old Indian and his fire. She wondered when he was going to call Charles to him. Her mother told her that one day she might have to leave her, but not to worry, for even though she was supposed to replace Two Feathers as the keeper of the sacred flame, she had chosen not to. Charles was going to take her place and tend the sacred fire.
"Usti Sakwo, little one,"
a voice called. Emmy stopped skipping, surprised by the voice softly calling her. No one but her mother had ever called her that. She looked around. She knew it was the old white-eyed Indian man who called her. Her mother had always referred to the color of his eyes as the color of the snow falling down.
"Do you hear me calling to you?"
he asked. Emmy smiled at him as she skipped over to where he sat by his fire, saying, "Of course I can hear you. I'm not deaf, you know."
"Sit down, little one,"
he motioned.
"I have been waiting for you."
Emmy looked down at him, then crossed her legs and sat down. "Why have you been waiting for me?" she asked suspiciously. "I thought you were here to speak to Charles."
"Because it is time,"
he replied. "It is time? Time for what?"
"It is time for you to understand about Ayohuhisti, the death of a human being, so that death will no longer elude you,"
he explained. "What does that mean?" she questioned, looking puzzled.
"You are still young, little one. You do not understand the finality of the death of a physical being. One day soon, maybe tomorrow, you will understand. And when that day comes, I wanted to be near to answer your questions,"
the old man said, while sprinkling powders into his fire. "Where did my mama go?"
"She chose to be with your father, little one."
"I saw her a little while ago. She was here with you. When will she be back? I wanted to talk to her."
"I'm sorry, little one. You cannot talk to her. She has joined your father in the land of the Great Spirit. She will no longer yearn for her life on earth. She will not return,"
Two Feathers explained. "She has to come back," Emmy said frantically.
"She cannot come back, little one. It is not possible."
"Yes, she will. You just wait and see," Emmy exclaimed angrily as she jumped up and ran away. Charles raised his head to look around. As he looked around, he saw Emmy sitting cross-legged by the old crooked tree. He watched as she spoke with someone he could not see, although he was almost certain she was speaking with his grandfather, Two Feathers. She then jumped up and ran off. He could tell she was in a tizzy. She had a temper for one so young. He never noticed before today that Emmy had any abilities at all, but he was off rambling through Georgia when she was still just a baby. Then, after he returned home to Alabama, he married and soon after was off to war. He reckoned she was probably nearly 12, although she looked much younger. She did not seem as mature as their sister Cynthia did. Cynthia was the first of his siblings born in Alabama. She was 2 or 3 years older than Emmy was. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Cynthia walking toward him. Think of the devil, he thought to himself. She looked worried. "What is it, Cindy Lou?" he asked. "I heard a whippoorwill calling," Cynthia replied almost in a whisper. "I'm scared, Charles. You know Mama always said if you heard a whippoorwill's call this time of day, it meant death was coming. We do not need any more people in this family dying," she exclaimed. "When Mama heard one calling this late in the day, she would tie a knot in a dish rag or a scrap piece of material. She said tying the knot strangled the call of the whippoorwill and choked off their call of death. Do you think I should do that, Charles? Mama said if I was ever unsure about anything to ask you about it. She said you would take over after she was gone."
"Well, of course you should, Cynthia. That is what Mama would have done. So you do as Mama taught you, and everything will be all right," Charles assured her.
"I will go do it right now, Charles. I just hope I didn't wait too long," Cynthia said as she hurried toward the cabin in search of a rag. Charles watched her hurry toward the cabin and wished with all of his heart that his mother could come back. With each step Cynthia took, he felt a weight getting heavier and heavier upon his shoulders. He took a deep breath and then went in search of his brothers to help him finish burying their mother. When they finished filling their mother's grave, Charles looked to his brothers. Each bowed his head in prayer. They prayed to the Great Spirit as their mother taught them. However, the prayers offered no relief, no comfort for his loss. Charles was not certain that he had the strength to carry on. His mother had always been his greatest source of strength. That strength now lay in a pine box, cradled 6 feet beneath the cold, dark earth. 2. Death escapes her. Emmy ran headlong through the meadow. She was headed straight toward Nance's Creek, a small stream that ventured off the Coosa River. It was a place of solitude, a place of comfort for Emmy, a place her mother used to come to paint. She would load her paints and easel onto Kigali, put Emmy behind her on his back, and they would gallop across the meadow. It wasn't fair. She had waited all day to talk to her mother and the old white-eyed Indian man. Her mother had always told them their grandfather was very wise and had great powers, but her young mind was mulling over and rejecting what her grandfather had told her. Emmy had wanted him to use those powers to bring her mother back to them. She wanted her mother to be there all the time, as Jeremiah was. As she thought of him, she realized that she had not seen or spoken with Jeremiah since her mother closed her eyes 2 days before. Briefly, she wondered why, but right now her grandfather's words were her biggest concern. Why did he have to tell her that? He was supposed to be wise and powerful. She knew her mother was not gone. She saw her with her own eyes. Emmy slowed her pace but kept going, wanted to run out her frustrations. Two Feathers had always hoped that when Charity died she would take his place in Skiahi, the place of spirits, as the keeper of the sacred fire and its ashes. Charity felt his disappointment as he looked at her sadly and said, "I thought I had taught you endurance, little one. Dagiyo, wega, usti sakwo," which meant, "I'm tired." In the end, he conceded to her wishes and led her through the passageway so that she could join Henry. Physically and mentally exhausted, Emmy stopped running. The sun was settling low in the western sky, and she did not realize how far she had run until the sun sank over the edge of the earth and it began getting darker and darker. Reluctantly, she turned to go back home. When he and his brothers finished filling in their mother's grave, Charles did not immediately realize that Emmy was not with those who were gathered on the front porch, nor was she in the cabin. He looked through the cabin, even up in the loft, but could not find her anywhere. He had not seen her since she ran off after having what he thought was a conversation with their grandfather, Two Feathers. Charles walked back out onto the front porch, his eyes again searching the faces of his friends and relatives gathered in the yard. He then asked all of those still gathered if anyone had seen Emmy, only to get negative replies. It was then that he began to panic. He remembered so well the day by the banks of the River of Death, when his sister Mary was just a small child. She had almost drowned because she followed the spirits of the Chicataha Indians that were driven into the waters of the Singing River several hundred years earlier by the Spanish conquistadors. He also remembered a vision he had of Emmy. She was lost and wandering alone in the darkness. He tried to recall all the details exactly as they had been in his vision. Charles looked out through the increase in darkness toward the river, which was a mile away. It was probably overflowing its banks after the rainstorm they had received the night before. He knew they must go and find her. Emmy was far too young to be alone in the dark woods. After closing her eyes and letting them adjust to the darkness, Emmy could see a faint light off in the distance. She headed in that direction. Although it was dark, it was still warm and muggy out. The mosquitoes were swarming in the hot July night. The short-sleeved dress she had put on that morning because of the heat now offered no protection for her arms or lower legs. The briars and brambles tugged her hemline, and occasionally a thorn or two grabbed flesh, causing her to regret having run away. The underbrush was getting thicker and thicker, the ground marshy, but Emmy kept her eyes fixed on the faint light. She hoped it was a lamplight from her home. Charles, John, and Jefferson were walking toward the river, which lay northeast of the cabin. Uriah and Jackson were still searching near home, around the cabin and outbuildings.
"Surely that child would not go to the river all alone?" Jefferson questioned, his tone suggesting his superior manner. Being the more patient of the brothers, John answered him. "With children you never can tell what they may or may not do," John replied. "Children are young and innocent, Jefferson. They do not see the danger around them as us grown-ups do. When they are upset, they don't think of consequences." John had come to realize this when he became a father. Children were often
Sample complete. Ready to continue?